Hello and welcome to ChinaFile Presents. Today's interview is part of our ChinaFile Presents series, which since 2013 has brought ChinaFile editors into conversation with our contributors, as well as with scholars, artists, and writers whose thinking we admire. My name is Jeremy Goldkorn. I am a ChinaFile editorial fellow, founder of the China media website Danwei and various other websites, and resident of China from 1995 to 2015. Our guest today is the writer Paul French, who was born in London, lived and worked in Shanghai for many years. His book, Midnight in Peking, was a New York Times bestseller and a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. He received the Mystery Writers of America Edgar Award for the Best Fact Crime and a Crime Writers Association UK Dagger Award for non-fiction. His next book, City of Devils, a Shanghai Noir, received much praise, with The Economist calling it, saying, in Mr. French, the city has its champion storyteller. Both of those books are currently in development for film. Paul has also written many other books and done a bunch of other things in China, so he's a fascinating person to talk to. But today we're going to be focusing on his book, Her Lotus Year. Let's begin with an introduction to what it's about, because to those of us who grew up in the United Kingdom or in its 20th century colonial backwaters, such as me, Wallis Simpson is a familiar name. And she might also be to Harry Belafonte fans. One of his hit songs from 1957 was called Love Alone, all about Ms. Simpson and her third husband. So I've put in a bit of mystery for those who are not familiar with Wallis Simpson. Paul, can you explain exactly who she was and why she is the subject of such intense scrutiny in the United Kingdom?
Well, I think if people do know the name Wallis Simpson, they know it for one thing, which is that in the 1930s, she was the American twice divorced mistress of the Prince of Wales, who became King Edward VIII. Because he wanted to marry her, and this was not deemed quite kosher in royal family circles, he had to abdicate. So that was the abdication crisis of December 1936. And that meant that the King Edward VIII stood down and became the Duke of Windsor. He then married Wallis Simpson in the south of France, and she became the Duchess of Windsor, and they went into exile for the rest of their lives, which was actually a long time for her. She lived to a good age. And of course, his slightly younger brother became King George VI, who, of course, was the father of the late Queen Elizabeth II and the husband of the woman that most of us would probably know as the Queen Mother. So it was probably, even given recent days, even given Diana, even given Meghan and Harry, probably the biggest shock to the system of the royal family that had ever happened. And what was interesting about it was that when the government of the day, a conservative government, along with the Church of England, the official religion of the United Kingdom, and British intelligence, decided that the king should not marry this woman. And in order to defame her character, they whispered around, not to the ordinary people, but to the establishment, to the upper classes in their Mayfair ballrooms and country estates at weekends, something that was known as the China dossier. And this referred to a period earlier in Wallis's life, 1924 into 1925, when she had spent a year in China. And many rumors were circulated, and I'm sure many people listening will know some of them. I can list them. So if there are children listening, you might want to tell them to go in the other room. But famously, she is supposed to have learned an erotic sexual technique in Shanghai called the Shanghai grip, which famously, according to reports, can make a matchstick feel like a cigar. There was also the idea that she had posed naked for pornographic photos for Sir Victor Sassoon, of course, Baghdadi Jewish businessman running the Cathay Hotel and many other property operations in Shanghai at the time. There was an idea that she had been a ringer for a gambling concern, that she had had many affairs, broken up many marriages, that one of those affairs was with Count Ciano, who later became Mussolini's son-in-law and a very notorious fascist, that she may indeed have had an abortion of Ciano's child, and various other allegations against her. And these were whispered around in a way that she could not really respond to them. And she herself wrote in her memoirs that they were simply venom, venom, venom. But she had no way to respond. It was fake news, I think. No copy of the document has ever surfaced. Remember, this is the 1930s, and much of it plays into xenophobic, racist tropes. I mean, this is the time of Fu Manchu movies. It's the time of the Yellow Peril. It's very easy to say that a single white woman moving through China in the 1920s, there must be something going on. This is not what good women do, supposedly. So there was a great deal of racism, a great deal of misogyny, but of course it was all good gossip, and it circulated around at the time, and it has stained her reputation ever since. I mean, every so often, particularly in publications like the Daily Mail here and the Daily Telegraph and so on, up will pop a piece about Edward and Mrs. Simpson, and it will the Shanghai group will get mentioned, the time in China will get mentioned. Well, I didn't think any of it was true, but I also did think that most of those stories were true about other people. And this was the clever thing about British intelligence at the time. They took stories about other people and projected them onto Wallis.
So they were believable because she was, because of the time and the place.
The time and the place, and maybe the idea that you had heard this story before, but you couldn't quite remember it because it was 12 or 13 years before. You don't have Google to go and check what you're doing. You don't have a newspaper database to just simply look it up, and you just sort of believed it. And anyway, it was scurrilous gossip, and people kind of wanted to believe it. It was good to sort of, good gossip over the brandies on a country estate weekend. But the truth was, I think, that she had a much more interesting year in China, but also it was good to look into some of these rumors and lies. And quite honestly, sitting in Shanghai for a couple of decades on and off, it was a thing that people quite regularly came up to me and said that one thing that they knew was, didn't Wallis Simpson spend time in Shanghai? Wasn't there some sort of scandal about it? So I thought, as ever, I'm always trying to look at Chinese history through a lens that perhaps a wider audience can get into it, whether that be true crime and a murder, whether that be a gangster story, whatever it is. And this is really a way to look at a really pivotal year in China's history, 1924 into 1925. So much happens in that year. It's a year when the entire country could have just blown up. Right, and we would now have we wouldn't now have this monolithic China. We could have, who knows, a dozen or more different countries. It'd be more like Central Asia on the map.
If the warlords had kind of won the day and managed to hold on to their little bits and pieces of China.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, she arrives in the early autumn of 1924. She leaves in the late summer of 1925. During that period, Hong Kong has the single biggest strikes it's ever experienced, the seamen strikes that is supported by waiters and servants and everyone else. It's the biggest labor threat to the colony that it's ever seen. In Guangzhou, which at that time, remember, there's two governments in China. There's the southern government of Sun Yat-sen in Guangzhou. There's the northern government of a revolving series of warlords and people like Yuan Shikai up in Beijing. And the two are not particularly talking to each other. And there are labor strikes and fights going on in, I'm talking about bodies in the street type fights going on in Guangzhou. At the same time, we've got, later that year, Puyi is finally kicked out of the Forbidden City for good. So ideas of a Qing restoration are kind of floating around. And then by the time we get into 1925, we have, of course, warlord fighting going on. Not just the northern warlords, which most people know about, but there is warlord fighting around Shanghai as well, in Zhejiang and so on, which is not thought about quite so much. There's typhoid epidemics breaking out all over the country, various other epidemics. It's a terrible year for epidemics. It's a terrible year for weather. It's extremely wet, which is ruining crops and flooding villages and so on. And on top of all this, in May, Sun Yat-sen dies, leaving an enormous power vacuum in a still young republic, which, of course, as we know, Chiang Kai-shek feels. And then finally, perhaps we have the May 30th incident in Shanghai when foreign police shoot dead Chinese protesters, and that leads to anti-foreign riots all across the country. And by that point, actually, Wallis is in Beijing, but she is caught up in these anti-foreign riots as well. So it's a year when, and of course we've got Japan nibbling around the edges, particularly up in northern China and over towards Mongolia. We've got the foreign powers, British and the French particularly, trying to expand their little spheres of influence at this time. The Americans are in Tianjin trying to broker a peace deal between the warlords and Sun Yat-sen, but that's not going well because the warlords don't want to talk to anyone. They don't trust each other, and Sun Yat-sen has advanced liver cancer by that point and is not a well man. Plus, the venue they pick for it has literally got people dropping dead in the streets of typhoid, which is not a very nice way to die. And this is the China that Wallis walks through for a year, which she calls her Lotus Year after Homer's.
Can you explain the reference?
Well, it's from Homer.
And also, the Lotus Year, obviously. Well, explain the reference and why she could have a year like this against the backdrop of all this mayhem.
Well, of course, she chose the title herself in her memoirs, which she wrote in the 1950s, and it's from Homer. And you're a classically educated man, Jeremy, as am I, obviously, at the finest schools that the empire could offer.
The finest, only the finest.
And well, anyway, Homer refers to the lotus eaters that are shipwrecked sailors upon an island that become soporific and just eventually have no desire to go home because life is reasonably easy and pleasant for them. And so she called it her Lotus Year. And there were very tough, which we can talk about, tough elements to that year, but also in many places, particularly in Shanghai, and then again in Beijing, where she spent most of her time. She was within the foreign colony bubble, the expat bubble, if you like. And so there were certain protections. And even with warlords taking over the city, and I think in the time she was there, 3 or 4 different warlords ran Beijing. There was always a certain level of protection. As a European or an American, you were always somewhat off limits, right? There was not particularly any great value in killing or harming a foreigner. That said, bandits steal from anyone, and that was another problem across the country. You can get caught up in warlord violence. You can get sick. Your train can get derailed by bandits. All sorts of things can happen, but by and large, she sort of sailed through it.
Right. Yeah. You talk about the sense of, what do you call it, privileged invulnerability that foreigners at the time had. But it reminded me a little bit of the kind of late 90s, early 2000s in Beijing and Shanghai. There seemed to be a lot of sort of parallels between foreigner expatriate life in China in the 20s and, perhaps in the 1990s.
Well, that's true to an extent, but you can kind of turn that on its head and say, look, when I wrote about Pamela Werner, who was murdered in, the start of 1937.
In your book, Midnight in Peking.
In Midnight in Peking, yeah. Her famous last words to a friend as she cycled off into the darkness of Hatterman Street, which is now Chongmenwen, was, what can happen to me? This is the safest city in the world, right?
Right.
And, half an hour later, she was dead. So I think there's always an element of, yes, China is the safest place in the world until it isn't, right. which is sort of true. The other thing that I always find interesting from my work is people always say, oh, it's a wonderful place. It's so safe here. Nothing can happen here. And yet at various points, I keep coming across and writing about people who end up in Japanese internment camps, who get shot by gangsters in Shanghai, who get chased out of the country after, Japan bombs Shanghai. There always seems to be a bad ending. And it's also true that, in general, your health, mostly perhaps because we're young, mostly when we're in China, our health is with us, except, of course, when SARS comes along or when COVID comes along, as in the old days when typhoid and bubonic plague and whatever else came along. So there's a sort of echo there as well that, everything's great until it's not great. And when it goes bad, it goes very, very bad.
Right, right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Can we sort of go back to the beginning a little bit? And could you give a sort of a synopsis of Wallis Simpson's time in China? Where did she go? And perhaps you could introduce a little bit like why she was essentially fleeing Hong Kong.
Yeah. Well, this is very interesting because I know that lots of people listening, because I have these conversations all the time, will just think, I don't like Wallis Simpson. I see her as this dour-faced harridan, that kind of wasn't popular with the Queen Mother, and I don't like her, and that's kind of the press image of her and the media image of her. And I'm not going to necessarily disagree with that image, because I think after she became the Duchess of Windsor, exile was very, very tough. They probably did flirt with fascism a little bit in World War II. There then was a kind of strange period of exile when relations with the royal family and the British people were not very good. Having said that, this is a much, much younger Wallis. This is a 27, 28-year-old Wallis Simpson, who is from Baltimore, where she has a little bit of education at a private school, basically, good manners, speak a bit of French, ride a horse quite well. Didn't really need much more than that. She was a debutante, Southern gentility, if you like, but no money. So there's no money behind her. There's just good manners and a good name. She married a man called Win Spencer, who was a flyer with the Navy. So one of the US Navy's first ever Top Guns, just before the First World War. And he was an extremely good-looking man and a charming man, but he was also a drinker, and the marriage did not go that well. He was then posted to Hong Kong. Now, America used to have something called the US Navy Southern Patrol. Now, the Yangtze Patrol is much, much better known, and the Far East Squadron is much, much better known, which went up as far as Weihai. The Yangtze Patrol that went up and down, obviously the Yangtze. But if you've seen Steve McQueen in the Sand Pebbles, you'll know the kind of thing that they were doing. There were two boats, right old rust buckets, that had been seized from the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, 1898. And those were kept in Hong Kong, and they were called the Southern Patrol, because the Americans didn't need to do much down south because it was really British Royal Navy territory. And Britain's Royal Far East Squadron was there. But they wanted just to go up and down between Hong Kong and Guangzhou and just check on American citizens. And if there was a problem, they could sort of grab missionaries away if bandits were attacking the mission, or sort of, protect American interests. And he gets put in command of one of these ships, and he goes away, and Wallis stays in DC. And he eventually writes to her and he says, look, I'm off the drink. I want to restart our marriage. I'll try harder. And she says, okay. And she decides to go to Hong Kong. Now, this is fascinating in a sense because she's never given China a second's thought in her entire life. She's never thought about it. It's not even clear that she'd ever heard of Hong Kong before she decided to go there. She gets on a boat. She takes 6 weeks. She gets there. He meets her. He isn't drinking. He takes her to the Repulse Bay Hotel, which is now a bit of a concrete monstrosity, but at that time was a rather lovely place to go and stay, a very romantic hotel. And it feels like the marriage is back on. However, he then has to go back to sea. She sort of is living on her own in Navy digs. It's not great. She doesn't really fit in. There aren't many Americans in Hong Kong at the time. There aren't many other naval officers' wives. She can't really deal with the rigidities of the British colonial class system in Hong Kong. She can't make sense of them, right? And we can't. So how could she be expected to? And it was all a bit grim in Hong Kong at that time. Very, very stodgy British colonial. She'd go out for dinner in restaurants. All the food was boiled to within an inch of its life. It was very dry English society. She does go up to Charmian Island in Guangzhou briefly and sees the fighting up there. And there's a bit of a story about that. But she does go up there. But then she comes back. Win comes back. He starts drinking again. He starts to get violent again. He starts beating her up pretty regularly. It's verbal, physical, and emotional abuse. And she just decides, I've got to leave him. I've got to go. I can't let this happen to me. And she hears that if you go to the international settlement of Shanghai, you can get a divorce. So she gets a coastal steamer and she runs away from Win and she goes to Shanghai, where she finds out she can't actually get a divorce. You have to have been married in Shanghai to get the divorce in Shanghai. But she decides to stay. She's on her way. Shanghai is cosmopolitan, none of the stodgy British hierarchies and rigidities, a lot more Americans, a lot more fun, not quite as heyday, but a lot more fun. And this is when she just kind of gets out of this abusive marriage, gets out of this terrible life as a US Navy wife, discovers her independence and pushes off into China.
And then she goes to Beijing and she is befriended by Herman and Kitty Rogers, a wealthy couple who have a beautiful courtyard house on Shijia Hutong. And I really enjoyed reading all the sections, all the descriptions of Shijia Hutong, because I used to work on the street just south of it for quite a few years. And in fact, my wedding was in Shijia Hutong, on the other end of it from, I think, where where Herman and Kitty Rogers lived. You evoke this extraordinary atmosphere on that Hutong at the time. Could you talk a little bit about Shijia Hutong, who lived there, and what it was like in the 20s?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I should say, although Wallis is often associated with Shanghai because of all the later rumors, and of course, it was easier to tell sordid rumors about Shanghai in the 1930s than Peking, which was seen as a sort of slightly past it ancient city that wasn't even a capital anymore. But of course, Shanghai by that point was sort of city of sin.
Right.
You know, and she actually, although she enjoyed herself in Shanghai, really came to love Peking. She had a great affection for Peking, and like many people who opted in those days for Beijing over Shanghai, it was a very aesthetic love of the city. You know, she immediately decided to embrace the Hutong life, and she liked the ancient temples, the Yonghe Gong, of course, the Forbidden City, you know, Temple of Heaven. She enjoyed being able to move around the alleyways and laneways, the curio and antique dealers of Tianmen and so on. She loved all of that immediately. And this is not really often understood about her. You know, it's always thought that she was in nightclubs in Shanghai or something, but she wasn't. She was in hutongs in Beijing and little antique dealers mostly. Shijia Hutong, I think, was quite by chance. She had known Kitty Rogers, who had been a Navy wife, whose husband had died in the First World War, and she'd known her before the war, but they'd lost touch. She didn't know that Kitty had married the son of an American railroad millionaire, Herman Rogers, who had more money than he knew what to do with, and had decided he wanted to stay in China and write a book, another classic expat endeavor. Like most of those expat endeavors, he never wrote a book. But, I mean, there's no evidence of it. So but he could rent one of the great, you know, Sojourn courtyard houses in Shijia Hutong, which had long been an elite hutong to be on. Obviously, because of its location, not far from Wangfujing, not far from, you know, the legation quarter, not far from most of the offices of state and the Forbidden City. So from the times of the late Qing, it had been a major hutong. Like many of the hutongs, of course, it goes back a lot further. But many former Qing officials lived on that street. Many long-term successful foreigners lived on that street, diplomats and business people. And most importantly, I think for people who may visit it nowadays, if you go there, the Shijia Hutong Museum, which is a wonderful museum on that street, which is a couple of doors down from Wallis's, which is now a private residence and you can't get access to, but you can go into the Shijia Hutong Museum, which is a wonderful preserved Hutong courtyard. You can see exactly what the layout would have been. You can see how many servants they would have had. You can see, you know, things that we don't think about now: extensive gardens, tennis courts, even stables. Of course, were a big thing in the days before, you know, the massive subdivision and then subdivision again of Hutong properties when they were, you know, sole units. And that's really worth visiting. And that, of course, is the home of the female writer Ling Shuhua, who many people will know. And many people still know Ling Shuhua here in the UK because she lived in the UK for many years, and of course, famously in the 1930s, had a scandal of her own at Wuhan University when she had a very messy affair with Julian Bell, who was the son of Vanessa Bell, sister of Virginia Woolf, and that was the link between the May 4th movement and Bloomsbury in terms of modernist literature. So that's quite interesting. And I really, if you're in Beijing, and Shijia Hutong's definitely somewhere you want to go. I mean, the museum is great, the Hutongs are great, and obviously now we know that you got married there. There's reason for more plaques to go up on walls to commemorate famous people who live there. Yeah, and a lot of the houses down there do. It's very well preserved, and she loved living there, and she lived there from really New Year. Western New Year 1925 through to nearly September 1925. So she was there for a long time. It was very big. Of course, it led to rumors that were later circulated that she had an affair with Herman Rogers, or that Herman and Kitty were a threesome, or that she had broken up the marriage. None of it makes any sense, of course, because 13 years later, when she ran away to the south of France with the abdicated king and they got married on the Côte d'Azur, it was at the south of France home of Herman and Kitty Rogers, and they were the witnesses, and Herman gave her away at the wedding to the former king. So I don't think you'd necessarily do that if you'd had an affair with someone and broken up their marriage and it all ended in disgrace. So again, another rumor that doesn't make any sense. But she had a great life there. We don't think of Wallis Simpson as being very active, perhaps. We think of her more in terms of fashion, jewelry, things like that. But her and Herman, Kitty wasn't really a horsewoman, so Herman was quite happy when Wallis came. They would take their horses and, of course, ride across the legation quarter and then down near the Dongbianmen, like the Fox Tower, right? Which, of course, is a major location in Midnight Peking. Yeah, keeps coming back into my life, that tower. They would ride up, there's a slope that you could ride a horse up there, and then you could ride down that wall. If you've been to the top of the Dongbianmen, you can see how wide the wall is at that. One of the only bits of the old Tartar wall left, and you can see how wide it was. I mean, you could drive a car along there, and they would ride their ponies. It was a thing foreigners did. They would ride their ponies down all the way to Tianmen, because, of course, the other side of it there is the legation quarter. So it was patrolled by foreign troops. There were police boxes, Chinese police boxes all the way along it. It was a sensitive part of the wall going back to, fears of another Boxer rebellion. So they were sort of safe there, and they could do that and ride their horses along. And she did that. She played tennis. The British consulate, which, of course, is Prince Gong's old mansion, and now none of us can ever get in there, or at least you don't want to end up in there, because it's the PSB headquarters now. They had tennis courts.
Yeah, there are ways to get in there, Paul.
Well, yeah, there are ways to get in there. It's just the getting out again afterwards that's a bit tricky. And that she would go and play tennis there. And one of the things that's also gone, sadly, is the US 4th Marines, who were always the legation guard for the Americans. And people will know, if they know Beijing and the legation quarter, the American legation is the very furthest west of the legations on the main street, all the way down to Tianmen, and now borders up against what is now, but wasn't then, Tiananmen Square. And that is one of the ones that you can actually wander through. Or used to be able to wander through it, and there were restaurants and things in there. It was sort of turned into a bit of a restaurant dining area. But in there, the 4th Marines built an outdoor swimming pool, and there's pictures of her using that pool. And with the Marines, any American citizen could go along and use this swimming pool, which would be very nice in the summer months. So she loved Peking. She had all these activities that she did, as well as, I say, shopping for jade, shopping for curios, antiques, some of which I've traced all the way through, that she took with her back to America, then to London when she married Ernest Simpson, and then to Paris when she was with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Obviously lived in the Bois de Boulogne, the Villa Windsor, which later was bought by Mohammed Al Fayed, but it's still there in the middle of the park. So she was busy, and she also enjoyed something that I'm afraid foreigners don't do much now, but it was a great activity at the time, which was to go up into the Western Hills at the weekends. I mean, I don't know if you did much of that because I know you're a twitcher and a bit of a hiker, but I don't think many people go up into the Western Hills so much now. And you know, the old temples there would be rented out and taken over by groups of foreigners who would sort of have, you know, long weekends there and really quite idyllic. And she always she says in her memoirs that that was the most beautiful time, you know, the most, you know, was the weekends in the old temples in the Western Hills, or Fragrant Hills, as the tourist board likes to call it now.
That's right. Yeah, and that is another very evocative part of the book. The descriptions of the weekends there. It sounds truly.
I should say though, I mean, I think that is wonderful, and foreigners had been doing that for some time since the late 19th century, and of course, but even then it was, you know, she couldn't ignore what was going on in China. One of the things is, you know, I don't want to give the idea that she was in an expat bubble by virtue of, you know, her class, her race, the time. But she also was watching things. When she was in Shanghai, she was at the Shanghai North Railway Station, up at the top of Hongkou, and she saw trains coming in from the Zhejiang War with troops, you know, dying, dead troops, terribly wounded troops, and she saw the trains go back out with crates of ammunition and guns and weapons, saying, you know, made in Germany, made in Britain, made in the United States. All the foreign arms dealers were in there, of course, getting a massive payday from the warlords. So she did see that. And when she was in the Western Hills, you know, the men did carry guns because there were troops that had deserted from the warlord armies. There were bandits who had lost their land or lost their crops because of the warlords or because of bad weather. And by and large, they didn't bother the foreigners. It was sort of, you know, too much trouble. But you never knew, right? So she
a
would
lot
see
of people with
like,
guns around.
she
one
recalls.
definitely gets a sense in the book that she is in a bit of a bubble, but it's never completely quiet. There's always
No, and she does some very brave things, and we can maybe talk about theories about why she did it. But when she left Shanghai, the railways were out because of strikes and warlords and bandits. So she couldn't get the infamous Shanghai Express and do her Marlene Dietrich bit. She had to get a coastal steamer up to Tianjin, and Tianjin at that time was. This would be early December 1924. It's freezing cold. The Peiho River is icing up. So she's not going to be able to get out by boat. She's like the last boat in before it ices up. Of course, you know, it's not an ice-free port, Tianjin. And when she gets there, it's in the grip of a massive typhoid outbreak. And she goes to the railway station to get the train to Beijing. And which is now what, 31 minutes or something, the high speed from Tianjin to Beijing. Then it was a little bit longer. It was a matter of some hours. But it takes her nearly 2 days because it can only go along very, very slowly because of the bandits ripping up the track. The heating is all off. There's no canteen car on the train. First class is a bit of a wreck. The stuffing has all been taken out of the nice seats, and the Chinese rail staff have stuffed it all in their jackets to try and keep warm. So it's a mess. Every time they stop for water or more coal at the coaling stations or the water stations along the way, soldiers have to get off and stand there with their guns pointed out into the darkness because they don't know if, you know, like trains were regularly ambushed. And in fact, the equivalent of the sort of things that the British and American government put out, you know, travel warnings. There was a travel warning in place not to do the train line between Beijing, Tianjin, and Beijing, but she did it.
So why? Let's ask that question. Why did this American socialite who obviously had, you know, a very bad marriage that, you know, was abusive, but why did she take all these risks for her Lotus Year?
Well, she goes to Shanghai thinking she can get a divorce. She can't get a divorce. She could then get on a boat. There's like a boat a week to America. It's a shuttle, basically, that will take you back via Japan to the west coast of America. It's every week. Nice, luxurious ocean liner. Very nice. She doesn't do that. She gets a junky old coastal steamer up to Tianjin. When she's in Tianjin, there's also liners coming in, you know, it's the port for Beijing, right? So the liners are coming in from the west coast, from the Philippines or whatever. She can get a boat out. and back to the United States. She doesn't do it. She goes 70 miles inland to Beijing. So why does she do this? Well, in her memoirs, which were written in 1956, she rather disingenuously says, I was in Shanghai and I thought I'd go on a shopping trip to Beijing. Now, believe me, in 1924, with the railways not working, the postal system not working, the telegraph system not working, the coastal steamers subject to pirate attack, typhoid raging. Tianjin is a city full of warlords, perhaps about to meet Sun Yat-sen, but he's too ill to meet them. Beijing is going from one warlord to another warlord all the time, right? Puyi is literally 2 weeks before kicked out of the Forbidden City for good into the arms of the Japanese, and everyone's seen The Last Emperor. So all of this goes on. No one is going on a shopping trip to Beijing at that time, right? And in fact, other memoirs of the period, which I have in the book, say you could not get a hotel room for love nor money in Beijing. All of the missionaries were coming in because it was too dangerous in the outstations. Everyone who worked, out and about was coming in. Tons of Chinese refugees were flooding into the city from the hinterlands, disturbed by bandits and warlords. You couldn't get a hotel room. At the Hotel Wagon Li, which was in the legation quarter, wealthy people were having to subdivide their rooms and they were putting in bunk beds and everything to try and fit everybody in. Wallis arrives at Beijing railway station, that beautiful European-style railway station at Qianmen, which is now the Railway Museum. She arrives there and she's escorted by the head of the Marine Guard, the US 4th Marines, to the Grand Hotel de Peking, which is now the Nuo Hotel, the really nice old bit of the Beijing Fandian, which has the original ceilings and original staircases. It's the only bit worth staying in. The rest is all just sort of Soviet-style flop. But that's a beautiful bit, built in 1915. Best hotel in China at that time, arguably. Even better than anything Shanghai's got in 1924. And she gets a suite. How does this happen? Right? So this is what I think happened, to put it briefly. She got to Shanghai, and maybe from Hong Kong to Shanghai this way as well. In those days, America did not have a formal intelligence network. It didn't have the equivalent of the British or the French intelligence services. They still didn't do that yet. So it was all done in naval intelligence, and the State Department worked in a very ad hoc way. And if the telegraphs were down, and if the railways were out, and if the postal system didn't work or wasn't safe, the only way to move things was by courier. And of course, you've got, at that time, a dozen or more US consulates around China, and of course, the embassy in Beijing. So one of the things that they did, and we know this, was if you were the wife of a serving naval officer, you were sort of considered background checked. You were sort of considered cleared, And so women would travel, and at certain journeys, she travels with other naval officer wives up to somewhere like Shanghai. Where does she stay in Shanghai? She stays in the Palace Hotel, right on the Bund. So you'll know the Palace. It's the sort of pink and white hotel on the Bund, now called the Swatch Art Piece Hotel. The best hotel in Shanghai at that time. The cafe next door that everyone knows, of course, hadn't been built yet. That wasn't finished till 1929. So she stays there. Then she goes up to Tianjin. Madness to even go to Tianjin. She stays a night in Tianjin. And where does she stay? The US consul there gets her a room at the Astor House Hotel in Tianjin, which you can go and stay in today. It's been refurbished a few years ago. It's still a beautiful hotel. It was the best hotel in Tianjin. She goes and stays there. The place is swarming with people coming in from the hinterland, and yet she gets a suite there. And then, as I say, at the Grand Hotel de Peking. So the only way that I can explain her itinerary, which makes no sense if she wants to get back to America and get a divorce, because she knows by the time she's been in Shanghai, she has to go back to America to do that, is that she agrees to move documents. She doesn't know anyone in these cities. She does meet Kitty later. She does find a couple of other people she's met variously, just nebulously in Washington, D.C. on the sort of cocktail circuit who are there. But she didn't know that when she goes there. She didn't know anyone in Shanghai when she goes there. She doesn't know anyone in Tianjin at all. She she's moving away from getting back to the US. And I think it must be because she was couriering documents. She then meets Kitty in Beijing, who invites her to stay with her and Herman in this beautiful hutong on Shejiao Hutong. So she decides to stay a bit longer. But until then, I think she is.
Which I understand. I mean, the same thing happened to me in Beijing. One decides to stay a bit longer.
That's your Lotus Year, or which can quite easily become your Lotus 20 years or your Lotus.
Yeah, mine was my Lotus for 2 decades. That's right. Yeah. Well, I'm going to stop you there because I want to leave some. I don't want to have too many spoilers for this great book that is a really fun read and so fascinating. But I want to ask you one last question about your craft. So the book draws on a huge range of sources, and I know that this is your period, 20th century China, the foreign milieu, pre-revolutionary, and you've written a lot about this period. So obviously you have a great deal of stuff in your head and a lot of documents. But how do you keep all of these different sources organized in your head? Because you're drawing, I almost feel like, you're wandering around in your mind in this sort of world that's partly imagined based on all these different sources. And it seems quite a feat of sort of mental organization to be able to marshal all of these different sources and then tell a coherent story out of it.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, fortunately, I'm still pretty compos mentis, so I can hold things together in my head. I mean, I'm aware that won't last forever. But
I hope that's not insinuating something about me. But anyway, do go on.
I do find I can kind of keep lots of things in my head. I do constantly read memoirs and constantly reread, the big people's memoirs, the ones that I really like. And I'm constantly scribbling in notebooks and then have to sort of occasionally sit down on a Sunday afternoon and go through the notebook and say, oh, that can go there, that can go there. That's for something else. That's nothing. I'm very lucky that I have a lot of outlets. So I write regularly for the South China Morning Post Weekend magazine, who indulge my interest in bits of Chinese history and Chinese art history and things like that. I'm very lucky. I work with a publisher in Hong Kong who, apart from these sort of what I call the big books that come out, he publishes various collections of essays of mine. And we also now do a series of abbreviated publications of travel writing from really, I guess, what I would call the Victorian era through to Second World War. I think the latest we've done is 1926 or something. But, and a lot of that is trying to look at very big travel books that are often very boring and often by missionaries who have lots of stuff about their failure to convert the heathen Chinese and things like that. But also sometimes have an excursion, a sort of a walk around central Guangzhou in 1887 or a walk through Shanghai in 1915 or something. And those are really useful. They give you that sense. So grabbing people's things. I'm very lucky as well because I've been doing this for quite a long time. Everyone and his brother sends me their unpublished family memoir about great granny Ethel, who went to China, and got up to something. And most of them are very interesting to the family involved, not interesting to anyone else, but will have an address or one little detail, one place that they went, the name of a temple they stayed, the name of a hotel they stayed in when they went to Shanghai, Guam for the weekend, how much they paid for their beach hut at Beidaihe. It'll have some little thing like that, which goes in the notebook and then is very useful for later. And I try and just sort of keep all of that together, really. And I'm also lucky enough that with articles and book sales and various other things that I do that are all really China or Asia history for the BBC radio and so on, I don't have to sort of drop it on a Monday and come back to it again the next Sunday afternoon. I'm able to just sort of get up in the morning and do China history, China history, China history. I don't even have to do that annoying thing of going to teach any undergraduates or God forbid, creative writing classes or anything like that. So, it's just there all the time, in the mix, and then it sort of spits out. And I think I've been doing it for long enough now that I kind of can nail whether it's sort of, the East meets West Shanghai style, or the sort of, the Hai Pai or the Jing Pai, if you like, I can kind of get the kind of smells, bells and whistles, as we used to say, of China at that time. And also I remember one writer who wrote brilliantly about the history of France, of all things. He used to talk about the sheep stroppings, which are just these little things that you drop in. You do so much research and then you throw it all against the wall and you see what sticks. So you don't need to say every item of clothing someone's wearing, but if they're wearing something particularly interesting or something different or something that, they're wearing because these are the sort of shoes you wear in Beijing because every time it rains, the hutongs just become torrents of mud, right? Or it gets so hot before air conditioning that, the women all had Japanese kimonos or something that they wanted to wear. Something that has a reason that explains the life that people were living at that time. You're riding horses, yes, but I have fascination with the Mongolian ponies, What did the foreigners get up to? Not only that, but what were people eating? What were they drinking? Is kind of always of interest. So it kind of all just floats and revolves around, and some of it goes on a blog, some of it, particularly images, goes on the gram or wherever, right? Some of it becomes a magazine article, some of it goes into a radio documentary, and then some of it goes into an essay or an article, and some of it, like the Wallis story, eventually there's enough of it that you can do a 350-page book. But that's not going to happen with every nugget you get. But every so often, you'll look at 20 unsolved murders from the 1930s, and one you'll be able to get all the way through to the end of it. You'll look at like 20 different gangsters in Shanghai, and two of them you'll kind of be able to get to the end of their story, right? And with Wallis, she goes, she has an experience, she leaves, she goes into history. And I think that's kind of exactly the person I'm looking for, because if you write a book that says, which is really what the book is, that says, this is the history of 1924, 1925 China, and China could have blown up into myriad warlord fiefdoms and two governments and God knows what else. It could have all just, the economy collapsed, the agriculture just collapsed, everyone die of disease. I don't think that many people will buy that book. I mean, you might buy that book, members of ChinaFile and the Asia Society might buy that book, but that's not going to pay the rent, really. So, trying to find another lens that allows a much wider audience to get into it is kind of interesting. And that's true of a Chinese audience as well. I sell a lot of books in China, I have to say, because Chinese audiences like that slightly different lens on Beijing, right? Midnight in Peking is a different way for Chinese people to look at a city that they know. City of Devils is a different way to look at the history of foreigners in Shanghai, from the way that it's normally told, and perhaps a more sympathetic way. You can be sympathetic to someone who gets murdered and it doesn't get solved. You can be sympathetic to refugees who become criminals because they're being starved by the Japanese, right? And maybe, and the other thing I think that the Chinese audience likes, and I'm always told this, is if you can find a major world event that people know about, but before there really wasn't really a Chinese dimension to it. So like I think of like The Six, the documentary about the Titanic that people did. Everyone in China knows the Titanic. They've seen the movie. They've seen Leo and Kate. They know everything, right? They didn't know there were 6 Chinese people on that boat. Right. We didn't know there were 6 Chinese people on that boat. That wasn't a known story, and they uncovered that. Most people that I've talked to in China, of a certain education and worldliness, know roughly the story of the abdication. And it's often thought of in terms of the greatest love story ever, that a man would give up a throne and an empire for one woman. What they didn't know was that there was a Chinese dimension to it, that she spent a year in China. But when you say, look at the Duchess of Windsor, and this is my sort of final point, that year gave her a style and an aesthetic that went with her all the way through her life. She always wore dresses that were often inspired by qipao. She had them made by Mambocher in Paris, but she always had that with the Chinese knotwork, Chinese collars and cuffs. She always wore jade jewelry. Okay, later she gets it made at Cartier rather than going round the stalls at Qianmen. And she always wore the chignon hairstyle, which became popular in the West, but was really based on Manchu female hairstyles and sort of a chinoiserie hairstyle there. And she always did that. And as I say, wherever she traveled, there you can see Chinese screens behind her in photos that she bought in Beijing. You can see on the table lacquerware boxes. You can see a little series of ivory elephants that she records buying in Beijing. And like all of us who've lived in China and then moved back to the West, there will be these little things around your house that you picked up at a flea market, a souvenir that you picked up somewhere, and she was exactly the same. These things stayed with her because they meant something to her. And that was a time in her life that when things were bad, like for instance, when she was hounded out of Britain to France, she wrote a letter to Edward at that time saying, we can't get married. It's too much of a scandal. It'll destroy the monarchy. I'm going to run away. I don't know. I'm going to go to China. And he writes back and says, well, if you go to China, I'll come after you. Well, I don't know if he would have done that in 1936, but, China was the first place she thought of where she would go, because it was a place where, despite all the chaos and all the, the madness of what was going on at the time, and the dangers and the threats that were going on and the terrible things that had happened to her. And probably she never had children later because of internal damage that was done to her by the physical abuse from Win in Hong Kong. She still looked back at that time as a kind of, golden moment in her life, her Lotus Year. And I think, a lot of people that are listening to this who've spent time in China at certain times in their life, yourself, me, in many ways, despite what was often quite tough times and often, things went very wrong for lots of us at various times. Companies failed, marriages failed, we got lost, we got hungry, we got diarrhea, we got whatever, right? At some point we look back on it with a rosy glow and a nostalgia as our own Lotus years. So, I think that's kind of...
Well, Paul, thank you very much. I think I'd like to recommend everybody listening to this, her Lotus Year. It's coming out in the next few weeks after this recording in both the UK and United States.
Thanks. Everywhere all at once, ebook, hardback and audiobook.
All right. We'll go read it. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's good to see you again.
Likewise.